Bad morning, everybody. Welcome to today's episode of Bad Morning, episode 58. Today is October 2018. This is the Bad Morning News, where articles and news pieces that you would not hear on mainstream media. I'm sorry, we won't really cover celebrities and pop stars urging young people to vote or anything like that, but you will hear news that is mostly bad, that the mainstream media and their handlers don't want you to hear, news that is not in the trenches for one party or the other. But hopefully you don't end up too depressed. But here we go. Some housekeeping. Browser for supporting our show, for being a sponsor of the show. If you're tired of the major companies out there mining and selling all of your information, give Brave Browser a try. I'll drop a link following the show. Download their browser from, which would benefit the show. Great. Thanks for anyone who's willing to check that out. And we also have Patreon, and thank you for hearing that, and anyone who is a patron of ours. Anyway, my name is Cryptic Cynic, aka CJ. I'm your host today. I would also mention that we are seeking other hosts for this morning slot. We may have an afternoon show coming up at some point. Um, so if you're interested in either a morning or afternoon slot, give us a shout out in the Discord or in the comments or somewhere. Get a hold of us, and that would be awesome if you're willing to join on our bad news team here. But anyway, I will go forward with the news as best I can. Thank you for bearing with me with the less than ideal setup. Hopefully, in the future, I'll have more of a visual addition to the show, and that will make it a little bit more appealing visually. In any case, I'll start with today's news about Hurricane Michael. Just an update, a recent update on the hurricane. This is from USA Today, written by Doyle Rice. Hurricane Michael could rival worst storms on record to hit Florida Panhandle. Hurricane Michael could rewrite the record books. The storm, now predicted to hit the Panhandle of Florida on Wednesday as a major hurricane, could rival the worst storms on record to hit that part of the state. Michael is currently forecast by the National Hurricane Center to have maximum sustained winds of 125 miles per hour near its time of landfall, said Colorado State University meteorologist Phil Klotzbach. If that were to verify as its landfall intensity, Michael would tie with Eloise in 1975 and the Pensacola hurricane of 1882 for strongest winds for a Florida Panhandle landfall on record, he added. As of late Tuesday afternoon, Michael had winds of 120 miles per hour, making it a Category 3 major hurricane. Hurricane Eloise hit near Panama City, Florida on September 23, 1975, and killed 21 people. In the U.S., the 1882 hurricane hit near Navarre on September 10 of that year. Another noteworthy mark: if Michael hits as a Category 3 hurricane, it would be only the 10th major hurricane to hit the Panhandle since records began in 1851, Klotzbach said, and since 1950, only 3 major hurricanes have made landfall in the Florida Panhandle: Eloise 1975, Opal 1995, and Dennis 2005. A major hurricane is classified as a Category 3, 4, or 5 on the Saffir-Simpson scale of hurricane intensity. Thus, any hurricane with winds of 111 or higher is considered a major hurricane. As for the time of year, Michael would be only the 11th major hurricane to hit Florida in October on record. The most recent was Wilma in 2005. Florida tends to be ground zero for October hurricanes. Historically, about 60% of all continental U.S. landfalling hurricanes have hit Florida, according to Klotzbach. Florida Governor Rick Scott warned Tuesday that Hurricane Michael is forecast to be the most destructive storm to hit the Florida Panhandle in decades. It will be life-threatening and extremely dangerous. You cannot hide from this storm. You can rebuild your home, but you cannot rebuild your life. And that's the update on the hurricane there. So anyone who may be in the path of the hurricane, I definitely have my thoughts with you, and definitely do what you can to avoid physical injury, first of all, and if you can do what you can to protect your property, that should come secondary to your life, but obviously it's not fun to have your property damaged either. So I definitely have my thoughts with you, and definitely stay safe. I guess it's supposed to hit today sometime. I'm not totally sure. I have to go back and follow this later on and see what's going on. But yeah, it's interesting, as mentioned. Hurricanes hitting the Florida Panhandle aren't necessarily as common as some other areas of the U.S. That they make landfall. It looks like they tend to hit the Panhandle on years ending in 5, 75, 95, 05. Actually, well, it seems more like there's one per decade, so I guess there hasn't been one this decade yet. Um, but in any case, I'll definitely keep my eye on that and see how it goes. Hopefully, not as bad as it. Hopefully, it doesn't end up being as bad as it could be. So, it's just good to be prepared, I suppose. And Danielle Hatfield, thanks for being with us. Danielle says, once again, it looks like I'm in the path when it starts off to C at the end. Yeah. All right. Yeah, this next article is an interesting one suggested by Danielle. Thank you for suggesting this story. It's pretty interesting. This is from FoxNews.com by James Rogers. Grisly discovery: bones reveal Neanderthal child was eaten by large bird. Archaeologists in Poland have identified the prehistoric bones of a Neanderthal child eaten by a large bird. The small hand bones were found in a cave in southern Poland's Malopolska region, according to Science and Public Information Service devoted to Polish science. Discovered a few years ago, the remains were thought to be animal bones until they were analyzed earlier this year.
Clearly, my whitening toothpaste is.
Sorry about that. We got an ad. Let's see. I hate these commercials. Anyway, tiny holes in the bones indicate that they passed through a large bird's digestive system, according to Professor Paweł Waldy-Nowak of the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. It's not clear, however, whether the bird attacked and ate the young Neanderthal child or scavenged the remains of the child. Believed to be about 115,000 years old, the bones are the oldest human remains ever discovered in Poland. Experts from the Jagiellonian University and Washington University in St. Louis confirmed that the remains are digital bones from a child's hand. The Archaeological Museum of Krakow and the Polish Academy of Sciences also participated in the research, which will be published in the Journal of Paleolithic Archaeology. The closest human species to Homo sapiens, Neanderthals lived around 350,000 years. Scientists in Poland report that Neanderthals in Europe mostly became extinct 35,000 years ago. However, there are a number of theories on the timing of Neanderthals' extinction, with experts saying that it could have occurred 40,000, 27,000, or 24,000 years ago. In a separate study, researchers recently reported that climate change may have played a more important part in Neanderthals' extinction than previously thought. That's the end of that article. I find that last comment interesting, that climate change, that some researchers are now saying climate change may have played a more important part. I'm not sure exactly what that's supposed to mean. It kind of seems like it might be convenient for certain interests to constantly throw out that card, as they're always doing, the global warming climate change card. I feel like it may be just some scientists, continuing the fear mongering and saying, "Oh, hey, look, maybe they died of this so-called climate change too," since these some of these scientists are constantly coming out with stories saying the world's going to end in 2020, 2030. Who knows? I mean, they've been saying for a while that we're all bound for extinction and death due to global warming and or climate change, which yeah, I mean, I don't personally buy into all the hype around the human created climate change. I mean, if there is a climate change, I don't think it's something we can necessarily control. I think it's convenient for certain interests to have people believe that we're to blame for global warming and such, because it allows them to have more control of people, have a lot of control. In fact, if you've heard of Agenda 21, whereby it would basically involve global governance in the name of protecting all of us from, damaging the earth and everything else. But it would basically be a complete fascism, whereby they have complete control over what every person is allowed to do, obviously, what kind of fuels and resources they're allowed to use. And it's using things like the human created climate change is a good excuse for these people to take away even more of our individual freedoms and to force collectivism upon all of us in the name of protecting the earth. And it's quite disappointing when I have a few, liberal friends who see climate change as like their uh, the hill they're gonna die on. Like, to them, it's the most important thing, and but curiously enough, they never seem to complain about the fact that the U.S. military and the U.S. government in general, and other governments obviously, are the number one polluter in the world. I mean, if your politician is not going to address the military industrial complex and the money that goes into all of these ships, warships, and other mechanisms of the military, if you don't address that going into polluting the ecosystem and such, then you really are not going to get anywhere with banning plastic straws and plastic bags and all this shit that they try to do, thinking that they're doing something good. Um, it's nothing in the end. I mean, even an individual's car exhaust is nothing. Smoking cigarettes is nothing compared to what the military does. And I don't really see hardly anyone who's in the global warming camp really ever address that. But it'd be interesting to hear if any of them do. But we'll see. Yeah, Daniel Hatfield says, but straws. Exactly. I guess straws are going to be the end of us. Danielle says, depending on your view of climate change, this is either good or bad news. LOL. Yeah, exactly. Depends. I mean, I'm sure that's what some of these leftists will jump on, is to say, hey, that's the cause of extinction, so we have to all give up our cars and let the government tell us what we can and can't do. Otherwise, we'll all become extinct from global warming. or climate change as they call it now. And yeah, thanks for sharing that story. That's really interesting. Okay, the next story I want to get to here. This just broke yesterday. This is from antiwar.com. Nikki Haley resigns as ambassador to UN. Ambassador Nikki Haley has submitted her resignation on Tuesday and says she will be leaving the post by the end of the year. President Trump praised Haley, saying they'd solved a lot of problems together. In his comments, President Trump said that Haley had told him about 6 months ago that she wanted to take some time off. He says he will be naming a successor to the post of ambassador to the UN in the coming weeks. Haley's stint as ambassador, like other recent U.S. envoys to the UN, was heavily defined by U.S. hostility toward the UN in general, reacting furiously to every UN attempt to rein in Israel, and condemning Russia and Iran every time the UN didn't back a U.S. position on Syria. Her hawkish, bellicose tone had a lot of Western media outlets spinning her as a voice of reason, resisting President Trump's occasional peacemaking impulses and presenting her as a comparative moderate. Though Haley at times clashed with Trump on policy matters, her resignation appears not to be the result of any specific disagreements, but rather just that she feels the 2 years she will have served by year's end is enough. Her most memorable spat with the White House has to be from April of this year, when she announced a round of sanctions against Russia over Syria. The sanctions were not imposed, and officials suggested she got confused, leading her to fire back that, "I don't get confused." Because of her tone at the UN, Haley will be remembered as the face of surly, diplomacy-averse wing of the Trump administration, whose first, second, and third impulses are all various ways of confronting perceived international rivals, and that this is the way ambassadors have played the UN post for years, made her the media's comfortable face of the status quo, during a time when the administration was broaching the subject of rapprochement with long-standing enemies. And that article is written by Jason Ditz. So yeah, I just saw that yesterday, people talking about it, um, talking about her resignation, and I guess there's some speculation on some of the Republican side, wondering if she's going to run for president, possibly in the future. I remember she's been kind of a rising star. I think she was governor of North Carolina, I believe. Maybe incorrect on that. But she kind of came out of nowhere, became the governor, and then was chosen by Trump to be the ambassador. And she seems to be mostly as it says, I mean, she's mostly status quo for ambassadors to the UN. In the past, I mean, I don't really see much different from her as from anyone in the past. A lot of just uh, constant pushing of um, antagonizing Russia, antagonizing Iran, towing the line that many interests in the deep state have for wanting war with several countries constantly in order to continue to profit for their stakeholders in all of these military contractors like Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, all those guys. And as it says, she, the only times she really seemed to get scrutiny from the left even was when she didn't, when she was not, willing to condemn Israel, as some of the other countries have signed on, and issue these, small reprimands of Israel at certain times, and she refused to even do that. Those are a couple of the things I recall. But overall, I would just expect someone similar to her to replace her. So it's really kind of just a shifting deck of people really doing the same thing. I don't really uh, see too much in looking at these people as individuals so much as it just being a position that carries forth whatever the U.S. interests are at the time. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see who Donald Trump chooses next for the position. And it'll be interesting to see if she does end up running for president at some point. It wouldn't be totally surprising to me if she did. I guess the Republicans are probably looking for a woman to run at some point. She's probably high on the list for a lot of people in the neocon camp. And I have another article from antiwar.com. Senator Rand Paul pushes to halt Saudi arms sales over journalist's disappearance. The latest fallout from the disappearance and presumptive murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi could see the Saudis losing their main source of arms. Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, says he intends to force a vote on blocking further U.S. arms sales to the Saudi kingdom. Senator Paul announced the plan on a local radio show, saying he hopes to force a vote in the Senate by the end of the week, which would force a full halt to U.S. arms shipments if there is any indication the Saudis are behind killing Khashoggi. The fate of the journalist, who has been critical of the Saudi crown prince, has been a subject of speculation over the past week after he entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and was never seen again. His body has not been found, and Turkey has been pressing the Saudis on the investigation. Saudi war crimes in Yemen have led to previous votes on cutting Saudi arms sales. Though President Trump has previously opposed such cuts, the fate of the high-profile reporter may be shifting administration attitude on the matter. That's by Jason Ditz. And there's a little bit of a follow-up to that regarding what it mentioned about forcing Trump's hand. Journalist disappearance forces Trump's hand on Saudi Arabia. The disappearance of high-profile Saudi journalist and regular writer for The Washington Post, Jamal Khashoggi, has put the Trump administration into an uncomfortable position, obliging them to raise the questions about the disappearance and presumptive murder of the man by Saudi officials. Khashoggi's connections with The Washington Post made this a much bigger story than the disappearances of most dissident journalists in the Middle East. That he was in exile for writings critical to the Saudi crown prince and entered a Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October 2, but never came out, making it very likely he came to a bad end. Trump was virtually obliged to weigh in on such a big story, uncomfortable though it may be. His administration, after all, has long avoided raising any human rights concerns with the Saudis, and there are a lot of big issues to raise. Himself no fan of critical journalists, for Trump to raise this issue with the Saudis may ultimately set the stage for more questions to be asked in the years to come. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is calling for a thorough investigation by the Saudis into Khashoggi's disappearance as well, which also virtually obliges the U.S. to follow through when such an investigation doesn't happen. The Saudis, after all, insist that nothing happened to Khashoggi, and barring the Turkish government coming across his corpse at some point in the near future, that's a position they're likely to stick to. So that's a pretty interesting story I just heard about with this journalist disappearing, basically. People saying that he's likely come to a bad end because of his uh, criticism of the Saudi crown prince. We know they don't take criticism very well, and a lot of journalists have disappeared and come to mysterious ends at people who've been critical of the Saudi government and other governments. Um, and as it said, the only reason this particular man is getting more interest is probably because he's written for the Washington Post. There's many out there who've written for or worked for smaller outlets, other foreign outlets that the U.S. doesn't care about, who've disappeared, and no one really ever raises questions about them. But I mean, it is a very scary thing. I mean, there was just the story I covered yesterday about another journalist being found murdered. I mean, these people are probably on to something really, really serious and really dark, that they end up dead all of these times. It seems to be a pattern, really. And what most disturbs me about it is that we pretty much hardly ever get an answer. I mean, they just end up being unsolved mysteries. Um, One case I remember pretty well is Michael Hastings, who was an American writer. He wrote a few books about during the Obama administration. He wrote a lot of things critical about the Afghanistan and Iraq wars, and he just one day was driving in his some kind of fancy sports car in LA, and his car crashed and exploded upon impact into a tree. And the official story is just that he maybe was on drugs and maybe drove himself into a tree. And again, we still haven't heard anything really that makes sense other than that official narrative, and it's been almost 5 years now since that's happened. Just a lot of really shady stories. But yeah, that Michael Hastings story is still one that I hope to see. You know, the real facts come out one day, but who knows when that will happen. These things often can take decades before but it takes until after everyone's like forgotten about these people and the work that they've done, the journalism that they've done. Um, so yeah, I mean, well, I'll definitely keep an eye on that, see what happens, see if anything comes out. But a pretty sobering story, but it does raise all of those questions about the U.S.'s comfortable relationship with Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that they are probably the most repressive Islamic state out there compared to ones that the U.S. Um, government constantly propagandizes about, namely, Syria right now. Of course, Syria and Assad are painted as this horrible entity. Assad is painted as this crazy monster who just gasses his own people. Um, but the only reason that that's called attention to by the mainstream media is because going to war in Syria would be beneficial for the U.S. ruling class. There's a lot of money to be made in intervening in those types of internal struggles. Um, but the U.S. media says, look over here, look at Syria, don't look at Saudi Arabia because the deep state has been in bed with Saudi Arabia for decades upon decades at this point. So just another thing to keep in mind there, another thing to keep an eye on. Let me see if I can get the comments working here. Danielle says South Carolina governor. Okay. Okay, so that was in reference to Nikki Haley. She was the governor of South Carolina, not North Carolina. All right. Thanks for that. Thanks for that clarification. Danielle says, we'll see how the left reacts if she becomes the first female president. LOL, hypocrisy in action is my bet. Yeah, exactly. I've heard the same said about uh or even what's her name? Betsy DeVos, the Trump's pick for the Department of Education, I think it was, where people complained about a right woman because she's, a conservative and she's not some liberal big government type who would just expand chokehold and influence upon public schooling. They didn't seem to care about uh, that glass ceiling being broken because she was the wrong type of woman, apparently, according to the left. But yeah, that would certainly be quite an interesting thing to see if she were to become the first female president. I guess my guess is we would just end up seeing a lot more cognitive dissonance and partisanship as usual. Danielle says Saudis are flirting with fire, in my opinion. Yeah, I agree. We don't even know what really happened in Las Vegas last year. Exactly. All of these things happen. We never get answers ever. I mean, and people just forget about it. The government, the three-letter agencies, they just wait for people to be distracted by the shiny objects by Kanye West and Taylor Swift and whoever, the celebrities of the day. And people just forget about it and they move on and they just accept whatever the official story was at the time, and they don't bother to go back and dig into the real facts and the all the shady things going on behind the scenes. And that's how you just end up with these static narratives on whether it's on the Las Vegas shooting, whether it's on some of these other school shootings out there, or 9/11, or these mysterious deaths of journalists. Gregory Patrick says, yo. Hey, Gregory Patrick. Good to see you, man. Danielle says, hi, Greg. Gregory Patrick says, Saudi Arabia works with our international corporations to do evil. Let's see. West of them a lot lately. Or they mess with China, though, so yeah, never mind. They suck. Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the case. Danielle says, Secretary of Education, yes. Yeah, that was Betsy DeVos. All right, so my next article is from the Free Thought Project, which tells you this is probably about cops. Most of the articles I read on there are about cops, but they have a lot of the good stories, or stories that you don't see anywhere else, frankly. You certainly don't see them on MSNBC or CNN or whoever. But this is by Matt Agorist, the Pennsylvania, or taxpayers held liable after video showed school cop knock child's teeth out for no reason. The Pennsylvania taxpayers are shelling out over $500,000 to pay for a school cop whose brutal history has been documented in several disturbing videos. Churchill, Pennsylvania. There's probably no better example of why the government needs to get out of the business of education than the following story that took place at Pittsburgh's Woodland Hills High School. The school's resource officer from the Churchill Police Department was caught on film assaulting a student, knocking his teeth out, and completing a years-long sequence of abuses, now ending with the taxpayers shelling out the funds. After the latest incident in 2017, a group of several students filed a lawsuit and accused the school of creating a culture of verbal abuse and excessive force that allowed resource officers to shock students with stun guns and body slam them. On Tuesday, the group reached a settlement that will split more than $500,000 among the parents and children, as the Altoon Mirror reported. A video from 2009 shows Shaldis shoving a student into a locker without apparent physical provocation, then shocking the student with a stun gun and arresting him. One in 2010 shows a behavioral specialist lifting a student up against a locker and slamming him into the ground, breaking the student's wrist. In 2017, Shaulis was accused of punching and knocking out the tooth of a 14-year-old freshman accused of stealing a cell phone. An audio recording was also released of former principal Kevin Murray allegedly threatening to punch a 14-year-old special education student in the face and knock your teeth down your throat. In one incident, Officer Steve Shaulis can be seen on video approaching Ahmad Williams, who was seated quietly, it seems, holding only his folder and a writing utensil. Shaulis takes Wade by the wrist, puts him in an armbar, reverses his arm behind his back, and then applies a chokehold. Possibly aware of the camera's existence, Shaulis then takes Williams down a darkened hallway, where he then picks up the young teenager and slams him into the ground. Williams alleges the officer slammed him on his hands, injuring them. The principal, Kevin Murray, then comes over and pushes Williams' head to the ground. Shaulis then tases Williams 3 times. The officer was reassigned pending an internal investigation, and now his status is currently unknown. Many who've seen the video have already concluded their own investigation, and they believe the officer should be criminally charged. However, no such charges ever came. Too much has happened at Woodland Hills High School in the past 6 months for this to be ignored, attorney Tom Hollis said. All children, regardless of race, gender, or disability, are entitled to an education free of violence and abuse, another attorney, Tim O'Brien, wrote in a statement. Attorney Phil DeLucente, Principal Murray's attorney, attempted to exculpate his client from the incident, even though Hollis said the principal and another officer were present and did nothing to help the child. My client was not involved in the incident, and casting his name in this light with respect to the alleged incident is not only inflammatory, but completely unnecessary, and only done damage to his reputation, Mr. DeLucente said in a statement. But DeLucente's statement is inaccurate at best. Murray actually can be seen in the video helping Shaulis to taser Williams. In other words, Shaulis and Murray ganged up on Williams in an apparent assault on the child. Mr. Hollis said both Officer Shaulis and the principal need to be fired. Where there's smoke, there's fire, he said. This tells me there's a problem at Woodland Hills High School that needs to be corrected. Luckily for the other students, the principal finally left the school last year after resigning, but only after a mountain of victims began to pile up. The most egregious actions attributable to Shaulis happened last year. Quayshawn Wade, another student in April, was asked to come to the office at Shaulis' request. Shaulis was investigating the case of a missing cell phone. The officer reportedly told Wade he was responsible for the phone. Wade walked out into the hallway. Shaulis then allegedly called Wade a fucking faggot, supposedly overheard by another student. Shaulis then grabbed Wade, dragging him back through the waiting area into his office. He apparently threw Wade against the wall, against a chair, and then to the ground, all while being punched on his waist and the back of his head. The officer who claimed Wade was resisting arrest then mounted Wade MMA style and punched out his front teeth. The attack wasn't caught on film, but the initial encounter was, apparently showing Wade with his hands up, being compliant with the officer's authority and commands. Hollis told reporters his client will have to have 4 more dental surgeries to ensure his tooth stays in place. Now, only after multiple children were hurt will anyone be held accountable. Sadly, however, it will be the taxpayers and not the officer or the principal. And this article includes a couple of the videos that it describes in the article there. But again, we've heard many of these stories all over the country, unfortunately, and you know, basically adding insult to injury. It's never these individual cops or the school or the administrators of the school or whatever who end up paying the price. It's always the taxpayers who pay the price, and that should tell you about the institutions of the police and of the public school system, whereby, what incentive do they have to behave in a decent manner when they're not even being held responsible, even if they do something egregious and get found, at fault for those things, they never personally pay the price. I mean, the taxpayers are somehow now paying the price after paying the salary for the cop, for the school teachers and the administrators. It's just a complete shit show, and you know, in the end, it's the taxpayers who suffer the most, aside from the children actually being harmed, which again is being paid for by the taxpayers, being deciding to pay for, or being forced to pay for these kids to be held in a day prison, essentially, especially when these stories occur. But even in the absence of this level of egregious violence, I still believe public schools are mostly a day prison. That's that's something I've come to really accept in more recent years. And as the article says, it's just another reason why kids should not be turned over to the government schools. It's just always ends badly. In the most extreme cases, end up getting straight up beaten up by the cops or by the teachers. But yeah, I mean, my experience with public schools is not as dramatic as these stories, luckily. But I definitely have seen just a lot of the negative things about it, and you know, when I was a kid, I loved school. I was in public school most of my childhood, except for the first couple of years. I was always in public schools, and I understand that a lot of parents obviously cannot afford to send their kids to a private school or homeschool, as was the case in my life. I had a single mom who had to work all the time, and so she wasn't able to uh, homeschool me or anything like that. And unfortunately, as what happens to so many kids, they just end up being at the daycare of the public schools, which is what it is at best, is a daycare. And I loved it when I was a kid because I was like lonely. I liked reading, and I liked all that stuff. And the other option would have just been me like sitting around alone. So I liked school growing up until I got to like high school, and then all of a sudden I realized that they're really just controlling me, and it's ridiculous that these kids who are practically adults, by the time you're in high school, but you're still having to ask permission to go to the bathroom and whatever, and it's really kind of like a military light experience. I mean, if everything you do is controlled by the teachers, you're not allowed the most basic minimum of autonomy. I mean, it's almost like being put through like a military type school. But yeah, and it really hurt. It does hurt me to come to that conclusion, that I would prefer for public schools to not be a thing. But it hurts because I had a couple teachers that I really did like a lot, and I could tell that they were good people, and that they really cared about the kids. But at the same time, they're still working for the same system, and it's a system that exists to mainly indoctrinate, all the coming generations into accepting reality as the U.S. government and its interests would have us accept it as, and instead of really developing the individual and developing education, developing interest in pursuing knowledge and pursuing the truth, and in even just having a basic ability to employ oneself and have a job. I mean, it doesn't even prepare kids for that. So I mean, I really don't know what it does specifically. um, but yeah, and that's my views on that. But you can let me know what you guys think in the comments. Let me try to pull the comments up, speaking of that. All right. Gregory Patrick says, the enemy of my enemy ideology doesn't seem to pan out for people, I'd say. Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. Uh, Gregory Patrick says, cops in schools not the solution to society's problems. Yeah, I agree. It's, you know, I had, in middle school, there was a cop who was always around there. And he would occasionally break up fights, but at least even then, like, it wasn't as prominent as it seems to be today with a lot of drug searches going on. I did have one incident in eighth grade where the cops actually did bring in a drug sniffing dog and had us all leave the classroom, and they had the dog go around and sniff everybody's backpacks, basically, looking for drugs. And yeah, again, it's like they're treating you like you're a prisoner. I mean, when you think about that, I mean, the parents didn't have an opportunity to consent to their children's belongings being searched for drugs, but of course they don't care about that. And if I understand it correctly, in public school settings, I think teachers are basically able to consent on behalf of kids in those cases where the cops are doing searches. The teachers are able to consent without needing the actual parents to consent. So it's all just a fucking shit show at this point. Let's see. Danielle says, "What the hell is going on in Pennsylvania?" I do not know. I wish I knew the answer. For Danielle says, "Further support for homeschooling if you ask me." Gregory Patrick says, "I homeschool." I was able to jump on this show a couple times over the summer, but it's the kids' turn at the moment. Shut him. Gregory Patrick says, shut him down. Yup. Google and its learning tools are less of a chain than the state, slightly, but still. Yeah, I mean, it's always it's always a compromise when you use Google products. I mean, you know what you're getting, you know what their interests are, but at the same time, they're what's out there, they're what everyone's using, and they're easy to use. So it's for me, it's always like I keep in mind what Google does. I still am using their products, obviously, at the moment. I'd like to move away from them, but unfortunately, a lot of the alternatives are still kind of rough around the edges right now. But hopefully that'll change. And then, because I definitely love to totally divest from any Google product out there, but I think that'll still take some time, for me at least. But good on anybody who is uh, doing the alternative route out there. All right, I have this one interesting article I came across yesterday from AsiaTimes.com, written by Vijay uh, Prashad, How the Tentacles of the U.S. Military Are Strangling the Planet. In June this year, in Itoman, a city in Okinawa Prefecture, Japan, a 14-year-old girl named Rinko Sagara read out of a poem based on her great-grandmother's experience of World War II. Rinko's great-grandmother reminded her of the cruelty of war. She had seen her friends shot in front of her. It was ugly. Okinawa, a small island on the edge of southern Japan, saw its share of war from April to June 1945. The blue skies were obscured by the iron rain. wrote Rinko Sagara, channeling the memories of her great-grandmother. The roar of the bombs overpowered the haunting melody from the sanshin, Okinawa's snakeskin-covered three-string guitar. Cherish each day, the poem goes, for our future is just an extension of this moment. Now is our future. This week, the people of Okinawa elected Denny Tamaki of the Liberal Party as the governor of the prefecture. Tamaki's mother is an Okinawan, while his father, whom he does not know, was a U.S. soldier. Tamaki, like former Governor Takeshi Onaga, opposes the U.S. military bases on Okinawa. Onaga wanted the presence of the U.S. military removed from the island, a position that Tamaki seems to endorse. The U.S. has more than 50,000 troops in Japan, as well as a very large contingent of ships and aircraft. 70% of the U.S. bases in Japan are on Okinawa Island. Almost everyone in Okinawa wants the U.S. military to go. Rape by American soldiers, including of young children, has long angered the Okinawans. Terrible environmental pollution, including the harsh noise from U.S. military aircraft, rankles people. It was not difficult for Tamaki to run on an anti-U.S. base platform. It is the most basic demand of his constituents. But the Japanese government does not accept the democratic views of the Okinawan people. Discrimination against the Okinawans plays a role here, but more fundamentally, there is a lack of regard for the wishes of ordinary people when it comes to a U.S. military base. In 2009, Yukio Hatoyama led the Democratic Party to victory in national elections on a wide-ranging platform that included shifting Japanese foreign policy from its U.S. orientation to a more balanced approach with the rest of Asia. As Prime Minister, Hatoyama called for the United States and Japan to have a close and equal relationship, which meant that Japan would no longer be ordered around by Washington. The test case for Hatoyama was the relocation of the Futenma Marine Corps Air Base to a less populated section of Okinawa. His party wanted all the U.S. bases to be removed from the island. Pressure on the Japanese state from Washington was intense. Hatoyama could not deliver on his promise. He resigned his post. It was impossible to go against U.S. military policy and to rebalance Japan's relationship with the rest of Asia. Japan, but more properly Okinawa, is in effect a U.S. aircraft carrier. Japan's prostituted daughter. Hatoyama could not move an agenda at the national level. Likewise, local politicians and activists have struggled to move an agenda in Okinawa. Tamaki's predecessor, Takeshi Onaga, who died in August, could not get rid of the U.S. bases in Okinawa. Yamashiro Hiroji, head of the Okinawa Peace Action Center, and his comrades regularly protest against the bases and in particular the transfer of the Futenma base. In October 2016, Hiroji was arrested when he cut a barbed wire fence at the base. He was held in prison for 5 months and not allowed to see his family. In June 2017, Hiroji went before the United Nations Human Rights Council to say the government of Japan dispatched a large police force in Okinawa to oppress and violently remove civilians. Protest is illegal. The Japanese forces are acting here on behalf of the U.S. government. Suzuyo Takazato, head of the organization Okinawa Women Act Against Military Violence, has called Okinawa Japan's prostituted daughter. This is a stark characterization. Takazato's group was formed in 1995 as part of the protest against the rape of a 12-year-old girl by 3 U.S. servicemen based in Okinawa. For decades now, Okinawans have complained about the creation of enclaves of their island that operate as places for the recreation of American soldiers. Photographer Mao Ishikawa has portrayed these places, the segregated bars where only U.S. soldiers are allowed to go and meet Okinawan women. Her book, Red Flower, The Women of Okinawa, collects many of these pictures from the 1970s. There have been at least 120 reported rapes since 1972, the tip of the iceberg, says Takazato. Every year there is at least one incident that captures the imagination of the people, a terrible act of violence, a rape, or a murder. What the people want is for the bases to close, since they see the bases as the reason for these acts of violence. It is not enough to call for justice after the incidents. It is necessary, they say, to remove the cause of the incidents. The Futenma base is to be relocated to Henoko in Nago City, Okinawa. A referendum in 1997 allowed the residents of Nago to vote against a base. A massive demonstration in 2004 reiterated their view, and it was this demonstration that halted construction of the new base in 2005. Susumu Inamine, former mayor of Nago, is opposed to the construction of any base in his city. He lost a re-election bid this year to Taketoyo Taguchi, who did not raise the base issue by a slim margin. Everyone knows that if there were a new referendum in Nago over a base, it would be roundly defeated, but democracy is meaningless when it comes to the U.S. military base. Fort Trump. The U.S. military has a staggering 883 military bases in 183 countries. In contrast, Russia has 10 such bases, 8 of them in the former USSR. China has one overseas military base. There is no country with a military footprint that replicates that of the United States. The bases in Japan are only a small part of the massive infrastructure that allows the US military to be hours away from armed action against any part of the planet. There is no proposal to downsize the US military footprint. In fact, there are only plans to increase it. The United States has long sought to build a base in Poland, whose government now courts the White House with the proposal that it be named Fort Trump. Currently, there are U.S. NATO military bases in Germany, Hungary, and Bulgaria, with U.S. NATO troops deployments in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The United States has increased its military presence in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. Attempts to deny Russia access to its only 2 warm water ports in Sevastopol, Crimea, and Latakia, Syria, pushed Moscow to defend them with military interventions. A U.S. base in Poland on the doorstep of Belarus would rattle the Russians as much as they were rattled by Ukraine's pledge to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and by the war in Syria. These U.S. NATO bases provide instability and insecurity rather than peace. Tensions abound around them. Threats emanate from their presence. There's a little bit more mentioned in this article. I highly recommend it. It's really a good read, really getting to the core of the issue with just the extreme size of the U.S. military's footprint around the world. And this is one thing that I think just most Americans just have no grasp of. I mean, it just really goes to show how the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are just, basically one party when it comes to this issue. I mean, they never talk about it. I mean, how many politicians have actually come out and said that and asked about even this issue, asked why are we still in Japan, after 70 years? Why are we still in Korea after 60 years? I mean, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Why are we in all these countries? No one mentions that except for maybe Ron and Rand Paul, and a couple Democrats here and there. But overall, the parties are in agreement with being the world police and causing destruction. As the article said about Okinawa, initially, these people are tired of having their citizens being attacked and raped and brutalized by American sailors and Marines and all those people sent over there with our tax money to go fuck around and do shitty things in other countries. It's really disgraceful. That's the one thing that really gets to me. I mean, It really does. It really bothers me, and that's the thing that would most anger me when it comes to, because I talk about the left a lot, and of course there's a lot of things to hate about the left, but this is one thing that the right especially seems to support, basically, and the one thing that I find probably most disturbing about most people who call themselves Republican or conservative is just plain not caring about the U.S. having its fingers in every part of the world for no real reason, in my opinion. But that's my opinion there. Um, I'll get to some comments and then we'll close out the show for today. Danielle says, "What do they propose to defend Japan? They have no military. I believe we are there at their request." Yeah, I think, as the article says, it's the national government is the one that's still supporting the U.S. being there, but the actual local people are tired of the things happening. So I think it would be ideal, obviously, for every country to just be responsible for themselves and not create all these networks of military alliances. But that's I think that's another thing that was imposed on them following World War II is that they were not allowed to have a military, and I think that's only begun to roll back. But yeah, that's definitely a good question. Danielle says it looks like I'm in the path when it starts off to sea at the end. Oh, sorry, there's something wrong with the comments. It's not the right thing here. Let me fix that. I don't know why it's showing me the comments out of order. Anyway, let's see. Gregory Patrick says, I try too. The other sites don't work yet. We're getting there. YouTube is the definition of solid at the moment. And that was regarding the last article, or what I was talking about. Yeah, I agree. And Danielle says, yeah, I believe we are there at their request. Yeah, so let's see. I've gone a little bit over. But that's a good place to wrap up. And thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Gregory Patrick, for being with me today. I always appreciate you guys. Appreciate you commenting and sharing your thoughts. Again, I'll just mention we're looking for new hosts on the Bad Morning Show. Get a hold of us on Discord or in the comments if you're interested in that. And Danielle says bad morning, and I agree. Have a bad morning, everyone. See you tomorrow. Remember, screw the state, fuck the system. This has been episode 58 of Bad Morning News. Have a good day, everybody.